So let's get started then on this, our first module in configuring group policy, this time on the inner mechanics of how group policy ends up being processed. Here in this module, we've got a fairly long laundry list of items that we need to deal with that specifically control when and where a group policy object is going to apply to a group of users or computers. Because of the way the organizational unit structure works in Active Directory, and the fact that, well, GPOs can be applied to OUs, to the entire domain, to sites and services, there are a long list of just different tools that you can bring to bear to ensure that the settings inside that GPO end up being deployed to the correct users and computers. One of the very first things here is the GPO processing order and precedence order, which we introduced back in that 70-410 content, back in that last exam, at least with the precedence order. When you look at the different locations where a GPO could be applied, there needs to be some sort of order that determines which GPO will overwrite other GPOs. That precedence list determines that whether it's applied to a site or the entire domain or directly onto a machine versus an organizational unit, which settings in which GPO ultimately are the ones that win out. Now, inside of any of those individual locations, or for example, inside of a specific organizational unit, you may actually apply multiple different GPOs that themselves have competing or conflicting settings. Well, it is then the processing order that additionally determines which setting ultimately wins by creating what is effectively a priority order for the different GPOs that have been tagged to that OU. Also here we'll be talking about the blocking of inheritance and enforcement. These two are copied more or less directly from what we explored back in the 410 content. When you have that long tree of different organizational units that you've created, you can imagine a few situations where a GPO at a higher level in that tree may not need to be applied to organizational units lower down in that tree. By configuring inheritance blocking at the lower levels, you can prevent a higher level GPO from being applied to the objects in that OU. Well, obviously, if you have that, you have to have the inverse of it as well, which in the GPMC is the configuration of enforcement. Any GPO that is configured to be enforced will just simply ignore any blocks that have been set up lower down in an organizational unit structure. Now, in addition to applying group policies in multiple locations, you may also have the need occasionally to apply a group policy object to a container of machines, site or organizational unit, but only limit the application of that policy to certain individuals or certain computers in that OU. Here within the GPMC, you can configure that by Active Directory group or to specific users or computers through the use of security filtering. You can also configure it to just computers that meet a certain characteristic through the use of Wmi filtering. These Wmi filters are not easy to create, but once you figure out how they work, it kind of becomes an almost configuration manager-like experience for applying a group policy object and its settings to machines that look a certain way or smell a certain way or have a certain configuration. The use of security and Wmi filtering is a fairly advanced way to very specifically target GPO application, and it becomes incredibly useful as you try to define exactly where those settings should go. Once we complete that, we actually have 3 additional topics here on slow link processing, group policy caching, loopback processing, and Cse behavior that we need to explore as well. These 3 are effectively just a series of group policy settings themselves, that the settings configure group policy. For these 3, we'll take a look at a series of group policy settings that identify when a slow link has been detected, so maybe that user is on the other end of the internet, and if so, what are they supposed to do? How are they supposed to process group policy, perhaps without having to drag all of those group policy settings over that latent network connection? We'll talk also with loopback processing about the certain circumstances, the very rare circumstances, where you may need to just cheat the entire system and have user settings apply to an entire computer. Most often this is accomplished in terminal server or remote desktop server environments where you have user settings that need to be enforced for every single user that logs onto that single machine. And then lastly down here is configuring the Cse behavior, which effectively is the enabling or the disabling of certain aspects, certain folders that exist in that folder structure in the GPME, of which ones you want to apply and which ones you don't. I'll show you the long list of where they are and why you would turn them on and why you wouldn't. And then lastly, we'll take a look here at the abilities to force a group policy update. Now, you may be aware that group policies apply, the computer half of group policy applies when the machine powers on, and the user half applies when a user logs in. There is also a regular group policy refresh that occurs at an interval that is 90 minutes, plus a random offset of 0 to 30 additional minutes. This group policy update refresh interval is great because it can bring machines back into alignment with the baseline that you've configured in that GPO, but you may need to speed it up from time to time. Just actually get those group policies to apply immediately. There are 3 different ways here in Windows Server 2012 and R2 to accomplish that, either for a single machine or for an entire group of machines. And I'll show you how all 3 of these different ways work. I will also show you a way in which you can tune the refresh interval itself. So setting it up for computers or domain controllers, or even turning off the background refresh of group policy. All of these are just group policy settings themselves that you can configure in some configure group policy to manage group policy GPO.